did you first grow curious about the paranormal? Dare you dig deeper? You are listening to Hounds of Asher.
And welcome back to House of Asher. I'm your host, Steve Asher, and it is a blustery, rainy, little. If you can hear the raindrops coming across the top of my studio, you know what's going on. I don't really have to give too much of a visual. It's a little murky and messy, but welcome to spring, right? You're listening to episode 92, and most of you guys knew that growing up I was a huge sci-fi geek. As well as a horror geek, and one of the things that I always really liked was the concept of time travel and the literal physical applications of it and what that could mean for us as a race and as people, and would it change us, beyond the molecular level and things like that? Would it change us on a spiritual level and what all that entails? Well, we got a really interesting guest, and we're actually going to touch on that subject right after this quick break. Robert Riga, a Peoria, Illinois native, is a psychic medium with over 50 years experience within the paranormal field, in addition to the 35 years experience as a forensic psychologist. Robert has been involved in 2 exorcisms, both sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago. Riga is a mentor of 10 children of the paranormal, instructing them, teaching them in the ways of their gifts and their talents and how to use them most wisely. Robert volunteers at a hospice, ministering to the children and their families, seeing to their needs. He assists these young children in their transition from this earthly dimension to the heavenly dimension. Mr. Riga's mantra is, "We are all spiritual beings in a physical body." Robert Riga talks to the children about the angels that are always around them in times of need. All of the services he does are always free of charge. Robert is available for both public and private events. He has given many readings in person as well as over the telephone. Mr. Riga has been on many podcasts, such as House of Asher, Trapper John Touched by Heaven, as well as several programs in the United Kingdom. If you need any assistance or information concerning anything paranormal, he urges you to please contact him at 309-213-0325. Right, and we are back here at the House of Asher in the tumultuous rainstorm that's going on overhead. Oh my goodness. Let's get into this. I'd like to introduce our guest, Mr. Peeter Moon. Hey Peter, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so I have to ask, because like I said, everything that I really kind of got into come way of be it something like Outer Limits or Buck Rogers or even, Flash Gordon, all this different sort of stuff that touches on scientific applications and time travel and advanced, technologies and all that. What walked you into it? What was your gateway into all this?
Well, I would say, just as an incidental occurrence, I had a favorite television show when I was a young person. It was called The Time Tunnel.
Oh, wow.
And it was in the mid-1960s. I unfortunately didn't get to watch it a lot because it was on Friday nights, and I would always go out on Friday nights, but I did watch it. I think during the summer I'd watch the reruns, but that fascinated me. It was also the favorite television show of another man who would later become my collaborator, is Preston Nichols. Preston Nichols, I went to meet Preston Nichols in 1990 at a group called Psychotronics chapter, the Long Island chapter of the U.S. Psychotronics Association. And I went there because he was an inventor. I went to meet him because of his invention skills, and I heard this incredible story when he talked about the Philadelphia experiment and how the ship, the USS Eldridge, had traveled in time, had gone out of this dimension, and that all of this research concerning the Philadelphia experiment carried forward to Montauk Point in New York up to 1983. So I was subjected to a extensive lecture on this subject, and I'd never heard of any of this stuff. I asked if there was a book. They said no. Eventually, 6 months after that, I would end up signing a contract to write a book with him, and the following year the book would appear, The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time. So that's how I got involved in becoming a very interested and active investigator and author concerning the subject of time travel.
Well, you know, it seems sometimes that people are fated or somewhat steered into it. Call it synchronicity or kismet or whatever, but it does seem like at certain points in people's lives there's like that watershed moment, and just like you said, it kind of changed the course of how you were and who you were. Coming away from this and stepping, well, let me backtrack. Stepping into stuff like Montauk, I was exposed to some of that, somewhat in stuff of like In Search Of and things like that. It didn't really get as in deep to it as, say, maybe like Mr. Art Bell's show, rest in peace, and on the old the Coast to Coast show. And that's when more and more information started coming out about, you know, the actualities of things that had occurred. And I think that's when people really had to stand back and look at it, because, you know, you can kind of go, oh, well, there's like like the Montauk Monster, the different things that washed up on the shores and all that, and everybody can go, well, that's a whatever, that's a mutated this or whatever, or a bear with mange or whatever. You know, they always want to say this and that, and it very well could have been. But once you have so much documentation and so much outright admitting that certain projects were done, you know, like when you talk about the Philadelphia experiment, that was huge. You know, to the fact that it went past mere cloaking to actual invisibility rather, and subsequent time travel.
Yes.
Know? So, seeing all that and deciding to write about the subject, did you know that it would have such a large effect on your life? And you know, would you maybe have done things differently? Would you maybe have approached it in a different way, or would you have approached it at all? You know, because a lot of times people who deal with that kind of subject matter, be it as straightforward as or not, a lot of times have a lot of blowback from that. Did you experience any of that?
Some, but nothing. Well, I will explain. Is that if I had to do it over again, if I think from first off, I have no regrets of anything. If I wanted to be more calculating in terms of economic windfall from it, I would have written it as a book of fiction with Preston. Preston Nichols and I, we discussed this, whether it should be done as fiction or nonfiction. And he said that he told me he was somewhat familiar with science fiction, and he said science fiction fans do not like their stories to be real. They don't like their science fiction to be true. He said there are components of this story that read like science fiction. He says we can make it all, and we discussed it, and I was the one who sort of put my foot down and said, no, I want it to be true, because I knew too much circumstantial evidence of people involved that were pointing it to it being true. So it would have been better, more lucrative if it was done as fiction, and it would not have been as upsetting to people.
Well, what do you think that is? Well, I mean, is it? I think, at least for me, this is just my assumptions and speculations. It's like you can have the most pious religious individual who can be very dogmatic. I don't mean zealot or anything like that, but just very dogmatic. And then you can also have the most, hardened atheist, and they work exactly the same. It's just what they believe in is different. And it does seem like if you find people who are in various types of sci-fi or horror and stuff like that, you have different camps. You have some people like maybe they like fiction that's more like Tolkien, Lord of the Rings type stuff. Now then you start getting off into the sci-fi thing. It's like, that's too out there. You could believe that maybe people lived like this way back. I've quite understood it. I think there's a whole lot of room for speculation and for education if it actually touches on the real. For me, I like it. I like when something, bumps or steps clean over that line into reality, because for me it's so much more compelling. When you go too far out one way or the other, to me it loses, the believability of it, and for me it's harder to get into. I like something that's kind of rooted in fact.
Well, you know what? On that, what inspired me as a young person when I would read the works of Ray Bradbury or Arthur C. Clarke, and Arthur C. Clarke was much more towards the science end of it, but they would inspire me. They would inspire me of the infinite potential that exists, and that was inspiring. So as a young person, I said, I want to be able to do what they do. I want to have books on a shelf that will inspire people. And that was my goal. And of course, I did not anticipate walking into this situation or so many real players and circumstances, which have only continued to become more prevalent and relevant in my investigation. So I just wanted to say that.
Totally. Well, I mean, and the thing again is that you come away with different elements from sci-fi. Like with me, obviously I really loved, the H.G. Wells, stuff like that. As I got older, I started looking into stuff that was a little bit more political, things like 1984 and things like that. But whatever bug gets you, and whatever mentor, no matter how maybe fleeting in a way, but it sticks with you. You pick up something and it's going to foster it like a spore, and it's just going to grow into that. So you were talking about your partner. When you guys come together on this, was it sort of one of I call back to like the old series Odd Couple. Was one of you more of the stringent scientist and the other one was a little bit more kind of pushing the walls, go, no, let's do this, man.
It's very interesting that you say that, because see, Preston, of the two of us, Preston is the scientist, but he was far more wild and crazy than I was. Now he passed away in October, but he was he could hold his own in any scientific conversation and outmaneuver whoever was trying to talk to him about science. He knew electromagnetics. He knew it backward. He knew it so well he could bridge into the more paranormal aspects of science. So he could be a very strict scientist, but he also was, this led him into the quantum alphabet soup, which could be quite crazy. So when he would go off on his experiences or theories, which were not necessarily in the realm of science, which kind of like bridged to it or were extensions of it, yeah, he sounded completely wild and crazy. And at that point, I would reel that sort of thing in, because it becomes too chaotic. So therefore, I would restrict that element and to the well-being of everybody, because what happens is you get too chaotic and it starts feeding on chaos, more chaos, and you just have and Preston would speak in such a way as to discredit himself.
Well, that is probably very true of a lot of very well-educated people, but very to be a scientist, to question your own theories, you have to be somewhat self-critical anyway. But I understand. I have the same habit of I almost do it to my detriment. And like luckily I have people too that kind of go, hold on, let's pull you back. I think that works very well, and we used to call it having a wingman back in the day, and so it kind of works out pretty well for all the younger folks that are listening. But now, in regards to stuff like Montauk, and I want to definitely talk more about the books in more depth in a bit. The people that were directly involved with some of the experimentations and testing and all that stuff, how well did you guys know anyone from the program, be it people that were over it, people that were put through any sort of testing or experimentation? How deep into that world did you guys get?
Well, Preston was involved in the programming. He was involved in being programmed and programming others. And he discovered that he had, but he was leading a so-called regular life, which wasn't that regular, but he was leading a regular life. And then he began to meet people and have circumstances which would tell him he had a role in this. Before it was certainly, a household word or even a semi-household word. He would meet his he would have dinner with his cousin, and the cousin's husband would start saying, "Yeah, I saw you out at Montauk. You were my boss out at Montauk," and they would have a verbal altercation out over this because Preston had no memories of this. So Preston, he would also get mail that was, for his role in the Montauk Project, and he had no memory. So he was having two realities. He was having to come to terms with this other reality that he had, which was more than just a psychotic hallucination, because it tied to ordinary circumstances, people, places, and things.
Well, can I ask this then? Now, my mind goes to two different spots. Now, was this due to whatever sort of masking or screen memories maybe that they were able to put in place? Or did this tie into any sort of time travel alternate realities that any of these other people may have been in or experienced?
It's a very good question. And what is coming up right now it's not a new theme, but it's a theme that I'm getting a lot more clarification on. This is the whole idea in physics of what is called a collapsed wave. In other words, space-time is like a continuous flow. It only becomes three-dimensional when a wave collapses. Okay? It's called a collapsed wave, and one can study it. But this is so, in other words, if you would uncollapse the wave, all of this reality would go into a sort of harmonious flow. Now, how this affects the consciousness is a whole nother question I'm not going to necessarily elaborate on. It's something that one could look more into. But this idea of a collapsed wave, when the wave begins to uncollapse on some level, this is where you have radio and electromagnetic anomalies. I say radio because recently a person was experiencing such. I pointed out to them that it was a collapsed wave, and what was happening is the radio was going over her cell phone, and the cell phone was going over the radio. In other words, the two electromagnetic waves were mixing with each other. And this is what will happen. This is why you get the experience that is called a bleed through, where you will start feeling other realities or other people. It's because the wave is collapsing. Now, in back of a collapsed wave, you also have the phenomena what is called white noise. White noise has different definitions, but the most complete definition is that it's the entire spectrum of everything. The white noise. It's like when you have white noise on the TV, it's just everything. That white noise represents all frequency. So when you isolate it or filter white noise, you begin to get specific frequencies, such as, for example, this reality. So if the filter becomes unfiltered, you will have different realities bleeding in. Excuse me, now this is the same parallel to the same phenomena Aldous Huxley in his book, The Doors of Perception, explained as, what did he call it, reducing valve to the human brain. He said the human brain has what he referred to as a reducing valve. Now keep in mind, Aldous Huxley was experimenting heavily with mescaline at this time, and he would also experiment with LSD as well.
Right.
And he would die while under the influence of LSD. And it was sort of his bridging out, to ease his transition. Now, but the thing is, he talked about this reducing valve. He says, what these drugs will do is stop your reducing valve. Now, this was just a theoretical function or facilitation of the brain that he postulated. But he says, okay, so when you take one of these drugs like LSD or mescaline, everything is unfiltered. So you start seeing all sorts of things that you normally will be filtered out. So, and then on top of what you see is a lot of animation, enhancement, exaggeration. So you have the brain working overtime, to say the least. So this is parallel to what I'm talking about, a collapse wave. Reality begins to uncollapse, but if it does it in a very, I guess what you'd say, minor point of reference, you might have something appear in the sky like a vortex, a UFO, you might have signals coming in, this is what can happen. Somebody like Preston Nichols experienced a lot of this type of phenomena in his own life, much of which he didn't talk about.
Well, can I ask you this? When you're talking about the collapse wave, there's so many things that you say, because most of my research has been in the paranormal, ghosts and things like that, ley lines and whatnot. A lot of this really touches on that, because, you know, who's to say that when people are experiencing what they feel is a ghost or some sort of haunting, it's when one of those points collapses, or where you have a person. I'm sure you've probably heard this story. I think there was a movie, I think it was called Somewhere in Time, many years ago, and there was a guy, he went into a place and it was like it changed, even like on The Shining, if you remember that movie at all.
I never saw it, but go ahead.
Well,
I've seen parts of it.
Okay.
You know, Jack Nicholson was crazy, but I never watched them.
He was crazy. Well, it's so different from the actual book. But he that character went into a grand ballroom, and everything went to change. The mood changed, the lighting changed. There was people in 20s garb. You know, drinks were pouring, people were laughing. It was just a grand old time. And then it was gone, like it wasn't there. So did he actually have a time slip? Did he have some sort of perception from the now to the then, or is that even a concept that's even really scientifically valid? I've heard so many people say, well, the future, the past, all of it now, it's all the same thing, and which is hard for me to kind of wrap my head around, as I'm not a theoretical scientist.
I think I could explain it to you if you give me a couple minutes.
Yeah, lay it on me.
Well, you have, you know, if you look, and I don't have it right in front of me, but the definition of the fifth dimension in the Twilight Zone, you know, Rod Serling describes the fifth dimension. He actually does a very good explanation of it. But it's sort of, the fifth dimension represents all potentialities. All potentialities. So we're on just one of those potentialities, that we're on a timeline. And all of these are like loops in time. So you have, there's something called the many worlds theory by John Archibald Wheeler and Hugh Everett, also called the Everett-Wheeler hypothesis, that, you know, talks about an infinity of worlds. And this is just, it's almost like a philosophical argument. And all realities exist. Everything, now this goes back to Hindu and Brahma. Brahma would, every breath, he would create a new universe. This is just the idea of infinite potential and infinite reality. And that is the fifth dimension. It's all potentials. Now, the issue in real life, as we know real life, is that we're on one of those potentials. And that's, so you know, it's, but because those are potentials, they can certainly intersperse with each other. And in the state of dreams, they can intersperse. And even in the state of dreams, dreams will connect you to the future. It may not connect you to the future, but it will connect you specifically to the future, but it will connect you in you know, in reality. Like you say, you can have a dream that you're meeting this beautiful woman, and like, who the hell is this woman? And then 2 days later you meet her, you know, or someone that's so much like her, now you know why you had the dream. So, you know, our mind, our brain, our spirit touches reality. It touches reality in that way. It touches the future. It touches the other things. So that's how we're all connected. That's a very simple explanation. And when we talk about the collapse wave, all of those things exist on a loop. And when one of those loops is affected or tweaked, it collapses and becomes an isolated instance in the stream of time. So what happens is, when you get into the paranormal, which often is associated with great darkness, you have to wonder who is influencing those realms outside of 3D reality. What is the influence? And then you're in the realm of angels and demons and intentions and all this sort of and control issues. I hope that clarified something for you.
No, I did quite a bit, and I wonder that if with the different experimentation that's happened in the last 50 years or so, if these different breaks and different collapsing of moments in time and whatnot, if that has been exacerbated, and is that part of our natural development? Were we forever meant to be able to transverse time or connect with whatever's going on? Was this sort of like a holding pattern that we were put in, almost like the kiddie pool? Now that we start, as we, obviously we're not there yet, but when we get to that point, will we then become more adaptable?
A kiddie pool is a good description, but to enhance that is that you have to recognize that the whole question you're getting at goes back to something that I was taught when I was a sophomore in high school studying Asian religions, and it all has to do with the universal conundrum is the wheel of life, the wheel of samsara, and the tragedy of continuous birth and death. And we learned that humanity at that time period, at least in the Hindu religion, was always trying to solve the mystery of birth and death, why it would go on and on and on and on and on, and you couldn't get off the wheel. And to get off the wheel was called nirvana. And that was, and really all nirvana can be is a harmonious relationship with the wheel of life. The wheel of life is symbolic, is in a different reference frame, but it's the same thing as what in physics they call a closed time-like curve. And in Einstein's general theory of relativity, he said that if you start to draw a straight line, of course you can't draw a straight line through space and whatnot, but if you could, it would eventually come around to the beginning. This is the nature of space-time. So everything is like a big loop. So, and this is why you have a character like Christ in the New Testament saying, I am Alpha and Omega, meaning I am the beginning and the end. He's basically giving an analogy of himself being identified with a closed time-like curve, which is basically, I am the beginning and the end, I am the be-all and the all. He is an uncollapsed wave, and that uncollapsed wave could represent eternity. It does represent eternity, because you will find some renditions of a closed time-like curve in an infinite loop of infinity. It will be rendered, that loop will be in a figure 8 or an infinite loop. And the body does mimic the figure 8 with the eyes and the breast and other aspects of it. So, we're like we're a part of infinity, and you could use theology and say we're a part of God, but we're a part of infinity, and we are reduced into a fall from paradise. You could even call paradise that closed time-like curve, that one loop that we're off of, and we're stuck in a little corner in a kiddie pool. And now so to be stuck in this at all without a reference frame, and there are plenty of reference frames to people who have throughout history who can refer to the paradise, eternity, whatever religion you want to call it, whether it's rendered in a good way, a bad way, a manipulative way, an idealistic way. They're referencing that there's something bigger than this world that we're seeing. And in these times, we're getting a lot more, I guess, what you call versatility of insight into different aspects. And the generation, I was born in 1953 in the, baby boom generation. This generation had a very different view of the world than our parents. And the newer generations have a different view yet still. So these generations will come along, and they won't necessarily view things the way previous generations did. So life is changing and evolving all the time. And where it goes is anyone's guess. But what's most important is where you are going on your own journey. And this is I guess the most important part of one's life. Not whether we're all going to become Democrats or Republicans, or we're all going to be, one world, whatever it is. It depends on where you're going and how you're going to do.
Well said. Peeter Moonen is our guest, and we will be back to talk more about this right after this short break. Robert Riga, a Peoria, Illinois native, is a psychic medium with over 50 years' experience within the paranormal field, in addition to the 35 years' experience as a forensic psychologist. Robert has been involved in 2 exorcisms, both sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago. Riga is a mentor of 10 children of the paranormal, instructing them, teaching them in the ways of their gifts and their talents and how to use them most wisely. Robert volunteers at a hospice, ministering to the children and their families, seeing to their needs. He assists these young children in their transition from this earthly dimension to the heavenly dimension. Mr. Riga's mantra is, "We are all spiritual beings in a physical body." Robert Riga talks to the children about the angels that are always around them in times of need. All of the services he does are always free of charge. Robert is available for both public and private events. He has given many readings in person as well as over the telephone. Mr. Riga has been on many podcasts, such as House of Asher, Trapper John Touched by Heaven, as well as several programs in the United Kingdom. If you need any assistance or information concerning anything paranormal, he urges you to please contact him at 309-213-0325. All right, everybody, we are back with Mr. Peter Moon, and what we are talking about. I tried to say talking on and touching on, so I said touching on. I was in a little bit of a loop myself right there. I apologize. What I was going to ask you was actually one of the questions that come from the chat room from Donna, and she had asked, I guess she was talking about the segment where you were talking about God and the Alpha and the Omega. In your opinion, is time sentient? That's deep. I don't know what to say on that one.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Is time sentient? I would say that time and space, or space-time as it's properly called, are a manifestation of sentience. So it's like, you could call it in that sense, God manifest. So is time itself, is it sentient? You can personify time, like with Father Time, or with the god Kronos or Saturn. You can personify time. And there's a saying that time is the only teacher that eats all its pupils, which is time is a teacher. But time is obviously a manifestation of becoming aware of a field. So that's the best I can do answering that question.
Okay. Another question was from Sammy from Philly, and he was talking about it. First, he wanted to know if you'd ever seen the movie The Langoliers.
Never
Stephen King. Okay. Well,
I've seen very little Stephen King. I did see The Lawnmower Man, which is supposedly based on Montauk Project, but I have not. And the only Stephen King book I did read was a book on how to write. Excellent book. It's probably his best book, although I haven't read his fiction book.
Now, was this the Dance Macabre book?
I'm not. I obviously know who Stephen King is. I've heard him talk, and his book on writing is excellent. But I just have not read his fiction.
Right.
I've only seen The Lawnmower Man.
Well, I'm so sorry. All he was saying was basically the premise was an airport, people stop there, everyone else disappears with them. It's almost like they're out of loop. There is food there, but it doesn't taste right. It's almost like it's an imitation of... It was almost like the food that was there 5 seconds ago, but it's no longer fresh. It's now like if you're trying to eat a piece of... Like you've seen people try to make meat out of different things, but it doesn't taste quite right. It's sort of like that. It's almost like a Star Trek replicator, and they don't quite have the recipe right. But what he was kind of wondering is, do you feel that there's a higher power in regards of almost like I don't know if maybe he's getting at an authority of someone like much further advanced than we are down the time travel pathway, who are either watching out for this or maybe either helping lesser growing civilizations or hindering them so they don't get up into a threatening situation against them. which is
Well,
it's a
of
little
course,
bit argumentative.
this is not a new idea, and the answer would have to be an affirmative yes. But you see it in depictions of the Trojan War, where the gods are overlooking. Sometimes they're depicted in dramas, but it's also, I believe, in the Iliad, where the gods are like watching over the mortals below. And you also have the concept of the Watchers in both the biblical or the Enochian tradition and in the magical tradition or Wiccan tradition, where they talk about the Watchers of the Four Towers of East, West, South, and North, and this sort of thing. So it's like, yeah, are there Watchers outside? Yes. Are there consciousness? In the works of Aleister Crowley, he talks about the secret chiefs. He says, don't try and contact the secret chiefs. If they want to get in contact with you, you don't have to knock on their door. They'll find you. And he also identifies the secret chiefs with the 12, as you get deeper into them, the 12 signs of the Zodiac, and these are just basically 12 parts of a circle or of a sphere. The Zodiac, it becomes symbolical for understanding the universe from different reference points. It's a little like understanding the world through the eyes of a Chinese person, a Russian, an American, a Mexican. You understand all of these viewpoints to make a whole. So, that's an analogy. But yes, of course, there's people who are, or consciousness, because we're just a small compartmentalized aspect of consciousness.
Well, it always seemed that, like you talk about the earlier works of people like Crowley, and they always would visit these different locations, and it always seemed like all these locations, people said they either had to do with star mapping or with tracking time, and I wonder if that was our very early kind of stumbling attempts to try to wrap our heads around the concept of time and space and all that, if that was maybe like our first steps into what we're doing now. And do you think what we're going to be doing in, say, 50 years is going to dwarf what we're doing right now?
Well, obviously, all these characters, from the Christian scholars to the scholars before that, the Moorish scholars, the Muslim scholars, the Greek scholars, all of them are trying to figure out, the universe. They're trying to figure out what makes it tick, how did we get here, who we are, find out one's role. In fact, one of the most beautiful things you can do in life is to discover your role. Aleister Crowley described this as finding your orbit, or finding your orbit in we each have a different orbit. So what is your orbit? And if you can find your orbit, it's like stepping into a team where you have a role and can play. People find this very invigorating. Whereas if they don't have anything to do, and then they get themselves on a team where they can participate and play, and they have a role. Even if and some people play the role of being a cook in life. Very beautiful. They're very wonderful people.
Well, sorry, I'm having a big torrential rainstorm now. If you're sounding like thunder outside, that's what's going on.
That's a real storm.
This is a real storm, yeah. Like I said, my little studio is actually on property at my home, and that's the way it is, man. You get, you may get a train come by, you may get that, you may have owls hooting out in the trees. It's kind of makes it part of the show. Well, let me ask you this though, in regards of writing of your books, in putting these together, were there any discoveries made? Be it like just in putting all the pieces together, almost like a jigsaw puzzle. After you come away with it, did you have any epiphanies? Did you maybe disprove some things that you had wondered or considered? What was sort of your takeaway in regards of all the information that you have up to this day?
Well, I've never really had to change my position on anything because I didn't have fixed idea. I didn't begin with a fixed idea. With the Montauk project, I recently published a new book. It's 120 pages additional to the original Montauk project. It's called the Silver Anniversary Edition of the Montauk project after 25 years. That has the original text of the book, but it also has a thorough summary of our investigation to prove that the Montauk Project did in fact exist. And we were able to, I was able to, because Preston's now passed on, but he helped me with so much of the investigation in certain aspects. There was an occult investigation, which I did primarily on my own, but also a journalistic investigation, which he helped me on. Those, what we were able to substantiate that a secret project did occur. There was a tremendous effort to cover it up, and many different aspects of it, tying it into the Germans and whatnot. The one thing we were not able to prove was time travel itself. So one of the biggest joys or epiphanies when this character called Dr. David Anderson came into my life, who had a time travel research center at that time on Long Island. It's now in the Southwest. And he actually was manipulating time, slowing it down and speeding it up in the size of a soccer ball. Now, as to fast forward to 2008, he invites me to Romania to participate in a conference. In 2009, he lectures extensively on time travel. In 2010, he announces on the radio that he can now move people into time. He can send people into time. He couldn't do that when I met him. So he had made a tremendous amount of development and progress in his research. So then in 2013, he actually, he released a patent. 2012 or 13, he released a patent application to me and to a few others that showed this. Now that's now available. It can be downloaded, and I've made that available. And it explains how time machine work. He calls it a time reactor. And also, I was able to break his research down into very simple language, and I created something called the Time Travel Education Center, timetraveleducationcenter.com. You can go there and you can read very basic physics and math. Doesn't involve anything complicated like quantum physics, and it's in 8th grade level math and physics that establishes that time travel does not violate the laws of math or physics. In fact, it's very simple. The question is, how do you do it? That can also be explained, but not necessarily applied. So that was something I didn't anticipate. It also demonstrates how he discovered that he could basically harness power, virtually unlimited power, by a time reactor. So it could sustain a tremendous amount of energy, which Preston Nichols said at Montauk they couldn't do. They had to get power. They couldn't get enough power to maintain a portal. So this was a great epiphany, a great learning experience. And now anybody can look at our website and watch 7 free videos on the math and physics of time travel and how it works on the mathematical and physics level.
I had another question from the chat room from Dylan, and he wanted to know, let me see, did Nikola Tesla, I guess, did any of his paperworks either make their way to Montauk, or did he have any sort of connection with early versions of Montauk?
Nikola Tesla was involved with the Philadelphia experiment, but not with Montauk per se. There were receivers of his, which Preston said were his receivers, but not so much Montauk. Now, he did have a place on Long Island years, over 50 years before Montauk took place. So there was tunnels. This is at Shoreham, Long Island. He had a whole tower. He was going to put the world on free wireless transmission and relatively free energy. So his genius, kind of melts into Montauk, but he's mentioned in the Montauk Project, but he's not at the core of it.
Had one more. Just want to make sure to get it out because I don't want to, people are nice enough to put something in there. Had Zeke, I believe it's pronounced Zeke, said, in regards to the Tesla thing you just typed in about, was he a time traveler? And how would you know someone was a time traveler if they didn't tell you? Is there any earmarks or maybe a certain signature?
And I wouldn't call this my specialty, but Preston would play on his very esoteric music machine, which at one time he called the Pyramid of Sound. He had different names for it, but he would put somebody, and this was actually, he developed what became quadraphonic sound, which was basically an abortion from what he devised, but it also served as a mind amplifier. If done properly, it would feed back. So you'd be in the center of 4 speakers, and it would be basically amplifying your old energy field. And he even designed it to improve the energy field. But if he put somebody in there and play the music Swan Lake, and it backed up, he said they were a time traveler. Now, there's 2 women I know who have been on that and had it. They're not the only people to back it up, but 2 of my personal friends, they backed it up. And he said when one of the women was on it, her hand disappeared. I couldn't see it disappeared because I was on the other side of her. But I saw her kind of flip in time, and she has weird time experiences. So that was one sort of diagnostic technique he used to tell if somebody was a time traveler, Swan Lake, which he said was the music that Tchaikovsky wrote based upon the creation of the universe. And Swan Lake was a high, that's what the music meant. It was the creation of the universe.
Wow. Well, I mean, I know that, even going back to Tesla, since he was recent, I knew a lot of his experiments had to do with dialing into the frequency of the Earth. Everything has its own frequency signature, and so yeah, I guess I could see how that could come down. I know personally, if I'm sitting somewhere, I don't care what I'm listening to, and my hands start disappearing, I'm probably going to freak. I'm going to freak a little bit. I think you would have to. I wonder if any prep was given to going, okay, you may see and experience things, or was it just like, holy crap, my hands are gone?
Well, she didn't see her hand disappear. He was jumping up and down practically while she's on the thing, and he's pointing to look at her hand, and I'm not going to jump over her because I'm going to have to crawl over the top of her. It's a small room. Right. I'm not going to crawl over her to look at her hand. And then later I said, what happened? And he told me. She didn't recognize it. She probably had her eyes closed. But then later I would get to know her, and I would see her act funny in time a couple times. And she also told me that she would see like different realities. Like, she could be sitting there in front of you at dinner, but she could see a reality of, walking down the street and going off with somebody else, or walking down to the park with somebody else, or going back to the train station with you. She could see all these different realities, multiple realities. And it was not pleasant. Her life was very challenging. But yeah, she had all the indications of a time traveler. There's also Duncan Cameron. And Duncan Cameron, who was part of the Montauk Project, there was a phenomenon I experienced with him at least twice. When you're in the car with him, it's like you think you've been in the car for 25 minutes, and it turns out you were traveling, when you look at the clock, it's 45 minutes or an hour. In other words, time would sort of seem to speed up when you're with him.
Weird. So like his personal whatever experiences bled out, I guess, to a point. That's a way to say it. Yeah. And of course, when you're saying it, there's a lot of, I guess, what you call empathic resonance or sympathetic resonance that might have to do with feeling, and not so much. I mean, it is still sort of a bleed through, or like, and say, like in a case like him, who is said to have been involved in heavy duty time experiments, he's not going to be living in the collapsed wave. He's living in the collapsed wave as a human being, but he's going to be outside of that a great deal of the time, at least in some part of his mind, which has been trained to do that. So he's reading almost like the attic of the universe, with that part of the attic that you don't see. And he's like, boom, 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 boom.
So like when he would do his references, his readings and stuff like that, he's talking in a very abstract reference frame that completely defies ordinary, logic, rationality, etc. But it doesn't mean it didn't have a logic or rationality to it. It just defies ordinary experience.
Well, it makes me wonder on a couple of different things. All right, two things. It seems like early on, in regards of healing and all that, if you go back, to the Greeks and all that, they weren't just treating the body; they were treating the spirit, and they were treating all this, the whole schmear, and it seems like we fell away from that. We went purely into medicines and pills and stuff, and then now it's slowly coming back to center. So I wonder how much of that may tie in with different things. And I ask this, I'm being very sincere about this. I know Trump was talking about a space force and things like that. I wonder if that's already in place in regards of time travel. And I wonder if we've had that, how long we've actually had that in place. Because you hear, science fiction, Stargates and whatnot. And like I said, I am throwing it out there a little bit, so don't let me go too far. But how much of that do you think is already a functioning everyday thing, or is it more of a breakaway civilization that we're not even aware of?
Well, I can tell you this. I have in my hand right here. I bought this book, Garden on the Moon. It's by Pierre Bouillet. Pierre Bouillet is the author of The Planet of the Apes. And this book, and I haven't read it, was referred to me by my friend Douglas Dietrich, and it's called Garden on the Moon, and it's about, I believe it's about the first trip to the moon, which was by a Japanese man, not Neil Armstrong. And the reason they sent a Japanese, and it was to prepare a moon base for the Germans, and because he would not be able to return. So they were more, I guess, in alignment with, self-suicide on a religious basis or whatnot. So and now that book, he said, will not be. Pierre Bouillet's first book, The Bridge Over the River Kwai, was heralded as a award-winning movie. And Planet of the Apes was certainly, a pivotal movie in the annals of Hollywood and science fiction.
Right.
He said this movie could never be made because it's too close to the truth. So basically, you've got, and this is only one instance of a secret space program. They did bomb the South Pole of the moon about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. That was on TV. Why did they bomb the South Pole of the moon? The most ostensible reason would be that they're to cover up any remnants of the Nazi base that was there. I can't prove these things. These are just things that have certainly a grain of truth to them,
right.
In some form or another. So when you get to the prospect of time travelers, Stephen Hawking said time travel does not exist in the future, because if it did, you would have travelers from the future coming to see us. And so they say, what about UFOs? And he sort of shuts up, like, oh, I didn't think of that.
Yeah.
So, yes, but the one thing we do know, and this is the whole key issue with David Anderson's technology, the technology exists, but it's not accessible. And there are people or forces that don't want it to be accessible. And this is the paradigm we live in. Human beings are in a restriction zone. It's like a prison of consciousness. And this takes us back to the whole Hindu paradigm of, the wheel of samsara, getting. Now, why does anybody care if you become aware? Well, the only reason they would care is that you have some sort of power that they want to keep in check. Somebody wants to keep your check in power. And in the end, it comes down to self-censorship. These are things that an individual person has to come along. So you just might say there's a delightful, I say delightful in quotes, game in the heavens, or that, it's like a video game. You're trying to get to different levels. And we're kind of stuck in this paradigm that's somewhat similar to a prison. It's not such a bad prison, as prisons go. But yeah, you have a warden, and you're not supposed to step out of line.
Right. Yeah. Don't worry about the man behind the curtain and whatnot. Peter, let me ask you this, because we're right about flat out of time. If people want to go to your websites and check out your books, and please give out the name of your books. We've talked about so much, didn't even mention them, and I definitely want to have you back on to broaden our discussion a little bit further. But how can people reach you?
Yeah, we can go in some more depth and interesting directions, but skybooksusa.com is my website to purchase books. Skybooksusa.com, the Time Travel Education Center, to learn about time travel. The most recent books that I published are the silver anniversary of the edition of the Montauk Project, Experiments in Time, and also a brand new book called Inside the Earth by a Romanian author, Radu Sinemar, which is all my work in Montauk and time travel took me to Romania, which is and David Anderson paid for my first trip to Romania. He introduced me to that world, and I have run with it for 12 years now. I've been going to Romania annually and investigating and having a great old time there.
See, and we could have ran 25 minutes just talking on like the legends of Dracula and tie-ins with the Eternal and the Never Dying. But if you're able to jump through time and you don't age as you do this sort of stuff, you would basically appear as an immortal. So we definitely got to get back and have you back on and to discuss this more. But
yeah, I just say that Dracula is what's called a red herring. He takes everybody's attention off of what's really going on. I mean, he's a real historical character, but all the fascination with him is like sending people in the absolutely wrong direction.
Wow. See, this is something we definitely got to get you back on and talk about. But Peter, we've come to the end of it. I want to thank you again for being on. And if you want to stick around for just a second, I'll talk to you right after this outro.
Sure. And thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And there it is, folks. Man, we just barely scratched the surface of this. And I definitely want to have Peter Moon back on to discuss this in more depth. And that's a thing that I'm learning. The older that I get, you feel like your time's slowing down, but in a lot of ways, time is infinite, and we're just a small part of it. But I want to thank everybody for coming on, checking out the show. Make sure to check us out on YouTube under House of Asher. Go to my webpage, stevieasher.com, to learn about my books about the paranormal and the show and appearances and all that other great stuff. But I want you guys to go out there and enjoy the day. Hopefully it's sunny, it's where you're at. But as the sun goes down and the shadows grow long, make sure to check under your bed, in your closet, down your hallway. You never know, there may be, who knows what there might be down there. But don't be afraid to learn about it, because sometimes in fear is knowledge. So until next time, love yourselves, love each other, and have a great day.